Hello everyone, Noik Games here with another video in the tutorial series of recreating the core version of Getaway Shootout. And this one is actually going to be the last one in the tutorial series. And what we'll do is to talk about all the changes and all the features that we've added throughout all these tutorials. And also talk about some more features that you can add to make it a more complete game and polish it up. So to overview, I'll actually just start by just playing the game, how it is right now. And the current state of the game, we have pretty much all of the core mechanics implemented into the game. So players can move around, they can pick up power-ups. And this is all like the original Getaway Shootout game that you can still play online. Now, a lot of the polish of the game, such as like characters, the UI, and other things like that, are still very rudimentary. And this is something you can extend when you're creating more of the game yourself. And I'll talk a little bit at the end of the video of how you can go about and add that into the game. But with this setup that we have just two maps in the game right now, and basically the maps are exactly the same, just with a different number. So this is the second map, and it behaves like pretty much similar to the original Getaway Shootout game, that you're just trying to race to the finish. And once a player gets up to actually 3 wins, that's when the game will actually be over. So like right now, one player gets to 3 wins. And currently right now, there's no game over menu or anything like that. That can all just be added, and it's pretty straightforward to add just a UI like that. As well as also adding a main menu, which I'll talk about later. So that's kind of just the overview of the game, of how we're leaving it as this tutorial series. Actually, we'll now go into some of the details of how we did it, kind of just overviewing what we did for the main features. The first thing that I'll look at again is just the player. So all the players in the game are instantiated at the start of the game, and this is from a player's prefab. So if I jump to the players folder in the prefabs folder, we see that we have a player object, and we have attached all the components of the player that are controlling basically the player movement, player power-ups, and everything else that needs to be associated with the player. And we also have some other prefabs in the player folder. This is just for more base players. If you just want a player in the background, or just a ragdoll player just that is interactable, you can add those into the scene. But this is the main player that gets instantiated, and the main script on this player object is this player movement script. So if I open up that, this was the script that we created to actually move the player around the scene. And I will note, so one thing I think that was helpful when creating the script, and I think is a good design choice, is to make the script not involve any input. So all the functionality of the script is just controlling the player object, and there's no controlling features of input keys or computer movement. All that is done with other scripts, and the two main functions on this script or the two main public functions, is to starting the turn and to actually jumping. So these two functions are easily accessible to be called by scripts that will control this. And that's what we did. We actually created some controllers. So we have the player human controller. This is handling all the human input to control a player, and basically calls those public functions, the jump function, and also the start turn function. And we do a similar thing with the player computer controller. Again, we're calling those two functions, the start jump, or let's see, the jump function somewhere in here, and also the start turn function, jump function right there. So that I think is a good design choice to actually split this kind of input logic and this control logic between the actual player movement, the script that is controlling the rigid body of our player, and this way it's just nicely organized. So that was just kind of a quick overview of the player that we made at the beginning of this tutorial series. The other big thing that we did in the series is to actually add power-ups to the game. And power-ups got a little complicated to make the system pretty general and to easily have players pick it up from power-up boxes and then start using it. But I'll quickly overview that as well. So with power-ups in the game, we created a system that we have scriptable objects that are basically, this is all the data about the power-ups in our game, and they all reside in this power-ups folder under the resources. So if you want to create a new power-up, first thing you do is to go to create, scriptable object, and then a power-up item. And this is where you can actually create your power-up item and assign all the data that you want with this power-up item. Right now it's pretty straightforward, pretty simple, just an icon representing the power-up. If you wanted to find the next player or orientate your arm to the next player, and a destroy delay, which is the amount of seconds after the last use to actually destroy the power-up item. But importantly, the one attribute that is actually associated with the physical power-up item is this power-up object. And this is actually the object that will be instantiated in the player's hand. And that's actually the object that is being used to actually fire a weapon or to actually activate the power-up. So if I jump to one of the power-up items, say the sniper, these are all in the prefabs folder under the power-ups folder. And these all follow the same or similar rule that they're all usable objects. They're all derived from this class called usable, which I'll show in a second. But this just makes it easy. So each object will be of that type usable. So we can easily, from the player, use the power-up to actually activate it. And all that functionality of firing a bullet or activating the power-up is done by the power-up script itself. So if I go to the sniper has this bullet gun class, and this is where it gets a little complicated because this is actually a class that implements this gun class. And if I go to the gun class actually implements the usable class or extends the usable class. And that's why I was talking at the beginning, is that this is the core class, this usable, and it is for any object, any power-up that can be used by a player. It has one simple function called the use, and basically you pass in the player that is using this object. And this is a nice little interface that any player in the scene can call to actually use the object, and all the implementation then resides in that usable class, and the player doesn't have to worry about anything about using it other than just calling it. There's also the cancel use that is called when the player stops using it. For example, when the human releases the power-up button. But that's not as important. The main thing is just this use class or this use method to actually use the power-up. And if I go back to, say, this gun class, that's what's actually being implemented is this use method. And here's all the logic of actually using the gun. Basically, you're checking to see if it has ammo left, you're firing it, and doing all other sorts of stuff to decrease the ammo and keep track of other variables that you like with the gun. So you can do something like this similar if you want to create your own power-up. Basically, you just implement this main use class and then implement the functionality that you want associated with your power-up. And just going back to this power-ups folder, these power-ups are all game objects, and again, these are the game objects that are being instantiated in the scene, in the player's hand, and those will have the functionality of actually using the power-up and actually interacting with the scene. So that's just kind of a quick overview of the power-ups that we did in the tutorial series. The last thing I'll overview is just the overall game manager, the script that is associated with actually managing the whole game. And it's pretty common to do this in a Unity project, to have one script, and we attach this one script on this scripts game object. And this one script is basically almost like the commander, the controller of the game that is associated with getting everything set up and everything hooked up right at the beginning of the game, and also handles functionality later in the game, such as when the round is finished and all sorts of other things like that. So this is the script that we created for that game manager, and the functionality that we implemented so far was just kind of the basic things that we needed to do with this game. At the beginning of the game, which is this awake function, which is called at the beginning of the game, we have kind of 4 steps of first creating the player input, next creating the map as the current map that the players are playing on, then creating players, and then finally creating the cameras to look at the players. If you added more features or added more game modes or something like that, you could add more functionality or more functions to implement those features. But for just the simple mechanics of this game, that is enough to actually basically get the whole game hooked up and wired up at the beginning, just with these 4 methods. And yeah, that's basically how we go on initializing the scene. And I think the next thing I'll actually talk about is kind of some things that could be improved, and actually some next steps that if you want to take this game and make it actually published or just more polished. I think one thing, the next step would be to actually create another scene, a main menu scene, and that would change up some of this logic in the game manager. But before I'll talk about that, I'll actually show you how you'd create a new scene. It's actually pretty simple in Unity. You'd just go up here, click new scene, and you can create an empty scene like that. If you're pretty new to Unity, I definitely recommend looking into how scenes work, or what are the use cases of the scenes. But for this, scenes just allow you to create a whole nother area of the game, a whole nother environment that has different game objects. So in this scene, we could call it the main menu, and then we could put a title for the game. In my case, this was Getaway Shootout. So I have the title drop down and basically a menu to start up the game, and have all the game objects in this scene associated with that menu. And the menu would be a pretty simple scene in terms of scripting. All you really need to do is basically set up the game to the amount of players you choose, and then call the scene manager to actually load the game scene. And the game scene is the scene that we were working on before. And I believe, let's see, it was should be in the scripts folder. But it is, I think, called sample scene right now. Scenes folder. Yeah, sample scene is currently what the game is sitting under. Maybe I'll just actually call this game for right now. Oops. And so the main menu, the main job would to be actually load the game scene, and that's when the players can start playing the game. That's where the maps get created and the players start playing. So that'd be maybe one of the first steps that I would do to actually make this a more complete game, is to have a main menu that basically just loads up this game scene, and then you can start playing. But if I jump back to the game manager, there would be maybe some things you'd like to change if you add this menu scene. The one thing you'd probably want to change is these variables right here. So these are just public variables that we can access in our game scene to control the number of players. But if we are working with a main menu and in the main menu the player chooses the amount of players, we don't want these variables to be declared right here. We'd either want it in this game state or somewhere accessible by the main menu itself. Because if these variables are declared public right here, the main menu will have no option to actually access these variables from the main menu scene, since the game manager won't be instantiated in the main menu. It's only instantiated in the game scene. So you could put it in this static game state on the game manager and access it through doing something like game manager dot state, and then accessing the number of players or setting it through there. You can do this because this state variable is static on the game manager, so you'll be able to access it on a different scene. But there might be some reasons not to do this, because maybe this static variable is maybe not a great way of handling something like changing the amount of players. Also, you may want to reset this game state every time you start a new game. So it might be better just to be handled by a different script that is accessible by the game manager in the main menu. But that is just one thing to think about in the future if you're adding a main menu. Okay, so the next thing that I'll talk about for actually another feature that you would likely want to add and that we didn't get to is add characters in the scene. So if I click play right now, the characters are just these like dummy characters. Again, we set the computer players to be green and the human players to be orange. But in the actual game, you would likely want to create your own characters and maybe have the players select the characters. And this could be done by a whole script that handles all the characters that you want in the game. And you can interact with the script to actually, every time you create a player, basically get the current chosen player for that character. And one way of implementing this, so if I go back to this power-ups folder, you could do something very similar to these power-ups and create a characters folder inside this resources and basically create a scriptable item for each character that corresponds with the character sprite, maybe some information about the character, a description, what type of player it is, and just all sort of data that is corresponding to this character. And that way you can keep track of all that data right in Unity. That's the nice thing about these scriptable objects. And basically you can do something very similar to the power-ups and load those characters at runtime, and then that way you can use that to actually create players and select your player in the game. If I jump to the game manager, once you have some sort of way to actually loading the characters, it would be pretty straightforward to actually getting these characters created. And that's because, so we're already creating the player in the game manager. It's this player prefab that we're creating. And when we're creating the players here, this is where I would add some sort of functionality to actually set the character's sprite. And that way you get the character in the scene. So by setting the character's sprite, that will visually change the character, and that's all the characters are in the original game. They're just sprites that are the images of the character. And you could do it directly here. So say you could do something like player dot get component, maybe your sprite render. I forget what child it is. You could find the child of that sprite render, and then basically set the sprite to the correct character sprite. But one thing that I kind of set aside, I think it would be nice to actually do this in this player body class that I created. And this I think I created actually behind the scenes. But this player body class is just associated with that whole player prefab, just managing all the components on this player, or all the like transforms on this player. And I think this would be a nice place to actually make a function to set the character of this player game object. And you could do something like this function that I already put, is to set the character, and this function would do something very similar like transform, and then get the child of that sprite, say if it's the third child or fourth child, and then set the sprite to the character dot sprite. And basically you would, at the initialization, you would set the character to the sprite, and maybe also just set a reference in this class. Maybe call it, again, just a variable called character. That way you store whatever character this object is. I'll just remove that for now. But that you can call right here, right when you get the component of the player body, is just to actually set the character as well. And that would instantiate the characters with the correct characters. The one thing that you would have to actually look out for is when the player actually dies, because the way we have it set up right now in the game is to have ragdolls to be created every time a player dies. And importantly, these ragdolls are separate game objects. These are new game objects that get created every time a player dies, and therefore they won't have the same sprite. So you'll have to do some extra code to actually set the sprite of the ragdoll as well when a player dies. A nice way to do that would to actually do it in this method here that's just basically copying all the information from this character's body, or this player's body. And if I jump to that method, you could have a nice section here where you do something like setting the character of the other player body that's being passed in, and basically you just get a reference to the current character to also set it to the same character. That way the ragdoll and the original player will have the same sprite, the same character sprite when the player dies. Okay, and then just the last thing I'll talk about that you'll most likely want to add when you are implementing more of the game. If you choose to kind of create more features, is one thing is the map system. So you likely would want to create more maps and make your own maps. So something like the system we have. So if I jump to our, let's see, maps folder. So this is in the prefabs under maps. We have currently just 2 game objects, 2 prefabs, and these are associated with the 2 maps. What you would likely do is to actually create another map, and this would be your own map here, and you can name it whatever you like. And basically, when you open up this prefab now, is you can now add your own sprites, your own game objects to the map, and basically this part is just a lot of design, a lot of creating your own sprites, and a lot of just creating all these game objects associated with the map. But there's 2 important things that are required with the current map system. The first one is the waypoints. So the map needs a waypoint manager, which is this script right here. And that was part of the series where we created this waypoint system, which is for the computer player movement, but is also for kind of designating the player progress, so the player can know how far they are in the map. And basically, you just need to set up the system for each new map, so that the game manager can get this component and to actually navigate the computer players throughout the level. The other thing that you'll need to add with your maps is just some sort of finish object. And that's how the players can actually finish and go to the next level. And in this sample map, what we did is create a finish object, which is this door right here. And all it has is this finish script. And basically, this is the script that's handling the whole finish logic. And the game manager will subscribe to this finish event when a player finishes. And you just need one of these in your scene. And also importantly, it has a trigger on the game object that basically decides when the player is actually in the zone of the door where the player can actually finish. So that's the 2 things that are required when creating a map, is just this finish zone and also just kind of a waypoint manager to navigate the players to the end. But everything else, you can choose anything you'd like, create any sort of sprites, objects, and add it to this prefab map, which is just in your folder here. And the final thing would do would actually be to add the map to this map manager. So if you wanted to add this newly created map, you would add it just to this list right here and set it like that. And that way it gets into the loop of the maps that you play with. And this system could be improved as well. So you could do something very similar to this power-ups again. You could create scriptable objects instead of just these map objects or these map prefabs. And that way you could add your own data to each map, a description of the map, the difficulty of the map, and any sort of data that you'd like. And then that way you can easily also load it on start just from this resources folder here. And that way you don't have to mess around with actually adding it to this list every time. But that's mainly just for adding data. But if you don't need data for your map, something like a simple list works how it is like right now. Okay, so that is basically all that I was thinking kind of as like future additions, and to kind of make it polished like the original game. Uh, you can play around with the game how it is right now. Again, all the code is on the GitHub, and the link is in the description. If you not sure how to download a GitHub project and set up with Unity, there are plenty of great resources online, and I also talked about that in the first video. But from there, yeah, you can get it downloaded and just start playing around with it. And yeah, basically, yeah, play around however you like. I will mention though, so if you're having difficulty kind of adding your own components, don't worry too much about the organization right away. I did try to organize it the best I could when creating this tutorial series. But I think the most important part is just to get all the sort of functionality that you want in the game. And especially if you're a new coder, don't worry about making it look nicely organized. Leave that to something at the end of the game, at the end of development, to actually get the code well structured. Because I think the main part and the most fun part of game development is to actually add all the features, add the cool functionality, the cool characters, and all that doesn't have to be perfect when you're just starting out making your game. And I think, yeah, the real fun of game development is kind of just adding the features and then also just focusing pretty much on all that and letting the optimization, the organization come naturally and come later. And as you improve your development skills, a lot of that will come to you as you go as well. So that would be kind of my tip as you go if you want to make your own games. Yeah, just to try to make as many games as you can and have as fun as possible time making the games. This whole tutorial series was done in the Unity game engine. I will mention there are a lot more game engines that have become more popular since I started. Godot is one in particular, but there's plenty of others, a lot of other open source ones. And feel free to check out those. Those might be easier for you to learn. And yeah, really just have fun with it. And also reach out to me if you have any questions about this tutorial series. And yeah, that'll be it for this series. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys later.